Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Put on your best winter coat because we're going to the Arctic today. And we have three of my friends here who are specialists on the Arctic, and they're going to talk to us about the military situation up there. I want to get us started in a bit by introducing you to Elizabeth Riddell Dixon, who is a retired professor of international relations at Western University. She's now, I believe, at the Bill Graham Center as a distinguished fellow or something. She knows a thing or two about Arctic shelves and maps and things, and of the who claims what part of the Arctic Ocean. So we may get around to that. Ernie Regier is in Waterloo. Ernie is, I remember him as the head honcho in Project Plowshares for many, many years. Now at the Simons Foundation in Victoria, in Vancouver. But I think he actually lives at home in Waterloo. And Adele Buckley is here in Toronto. Adele is an astrophysicist or something like that, aerospace physicist, engineer, and other things that I can even barely pronounce. But her main activity in life for many years has been helping manage the Pugwash conferences, and especially Canada's role in it. But she was on the council for the International Pugwash Movement. So good morning, friends. How are you folks?
Well, great, glad to be here.
Okay, it's nice to see you all. And we're going to talk about the military situation in the Arctic, but I think it would be wrong if we waltzed right over to that topic without first talking about the changing climate in the Arctic, because today's newspapers lead on the front page with stories about how much warmer the Arctic is than anybody thought. And does anybody want to give your impression about how newsworthy is this, or is it something we should have all expected to hear, given all the news about the melting clathrates and permafrost and all that?
I think I could start because as some of you know, there's a Arctic security discussion group online. Anybody can join it. But what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and it affects the global weather, of course. So that's why it's really interesting what's going on in the Arctic as far as melting ice. And we see this year particularly terrible results of changing climate. So we also have to look at what's happening to the ice, because when there's no ice, then shipping and other activities can occur, especially in the summer. And there's a lot of difference between the Canadian Arctic, which is much colder than the sort of Nordic and Russian Arctic, which is quite interesting, because if you can do shipping sort of along the coast of Russia, but you cannot really ship through the Northwest Passage. It really has ice in it all year long. So those are considerations when it's opening up, and it's considerations, of course, for military activity too.
Well, can they go from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Siberian Ocean or the Russian side, or is it impossible?
No, you can definitely. Russia has developed that side. They benefit from the fact that there's far less ice for the northern sea route, in other words, the one that goes by Russia. But Russia has for decades developed its icebreaker capacity, and it insists on payments, and it insists on escorting ships through there. But it is by far the most open of the two. And as an aside, for Canada, the fact that Russia has a regime for its Northeast Passage sets some precedents that we should be very happy about, because most other countries in the world, particularly the United States, European Union, China, don't recognize our Northwest Passage as being a straight use for international navigation. And ours is far less open, but you can definitely sail through it. There's about 5 routes and that you can get through. And
But not in the winter, is that right? I mean, if Adele
oh
is,
no, this is just in the summer. It's not all, and neither one of them is all year round.
oh, okay. Oh, really? Okay. All right.
I don't think.
Oops.
Sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead, Ernie.
Well, I was just going to add that the northern sea route and the lengthening of that season gradually where it is used is a lot of what is driving Russia.
I've just put on the screen sharing. Now you could
Sure.
ask me to stop, Meta, but you can obviously see.
As I was saying, a good deal of Russia's military development owes to the fact of that northern sea route and the shipping season gradually getting longer. And so the Russia actually has about 20 military bases that begin on Anadr, which is really on the Atlantic side of that peninsula, or the Pacific side, sorry, the other end.
Sorry, now you've got to orient us. Is that the Bering Strait where you've got your pointer now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the Pacific side.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
Pacific,
Russia has a string of military bases that run all along that coast and in some of those archipelagos, and they have their particular function is a response to the increased accessibility of that region, and so that there's more need for sovereignty patrol, and it's a very long frontier, obviously, that needs to be patrolled, and some situational awareness in it. There are spread throughout that whole area. There are 10 emergency response centers that they've set up. A number of areas where there are both military and civilian dual-use airstrips, and the military, the defensive part of it, emphasizes air defense and coastal defense missiles and those kind of things. And I'll just add quickly, and then at the other end, towards the Atlantic, then the Russian military interest shifts quite a lot, because there it's really more of a strategic international role, not a more of a domestic territorial role that the other part is.
But hold on, I'm not sure. Just a sec. I'm not sure what you mean by domestic. I mean, what reason is there to have a military except for international relations?
Oh, well, as we do in Canada, we have coastal patrols and coastal radars, all of those things. You have to protect a shoreline. Russia has a large population in the Arctic, and so you need to have an emergency response capability.
Okay, so it might be just things like shipwrecks, and not necessarily that you've got an enemy that's going to attack you in.
Well, I mean, part of it is that you have to know whether or not there's someone breaching your frontiers. So you have to have situational awareness, and the need for that is increased the more that the region is accessible. But if you go then to more to the bottom of that map in the Barents Sea area, that area, that's a bastion that Russia is very keen to protect, because that's where their intercontinental ballistic submarines patrol mostly, and they have a number of other systems with standoff weapons from that sea they can reach northern Europe, and they can reach all of North America with ballistic intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the defense operations in the Franz Josef Land and that area is very much intended to protect that bastion and to prevent NATO from getting access to it. And of course, the counter the Americans have increasing interest in actually patrolling there, and they do, and that's really where the to the extent that there is military tension, it's in that region. It's not up all along the Northern Sea route and up towards the Bering Strait. That
Now,
I mean,
I every now and then I hear some news item about Norway is accusing the Russians of getting too close, or vice versa. You're getting in our waters, go away, guys, kind of thing.
well,
It's
that's more
Norway,
towards.
Norway as
This
or
is
NATO
Norway,
in general.
right here.
Yeah.
This is Norway.
And Norway is
long peace joins on to a border with Russia here, and
Yeah.
NATO cleverly and dangerously decides to do military exercises in here just to show Russia that they're around.
That gap there, and Russia has an interest in moving down into the North Atlantic in the event of a European conflict, because related to interrupting sea lane connections from North America to Europe. So Russia has a strategic interest in being able to move into the North Atlantic and operate there, and NATO has an interest in being able to move into the Barents Sea and close to the Kola Peninsula in the event of a European conflict. So that's the to the extent that there is tension and conflict in the Arctic, it's not as a result of Arctic specific conflicts and conflicting interests. It's as a result of potential conflict in Europe, which then NATO would want to spill over into the Arctic in order to attack the Kola Peninsula to prevent reinforcements from there. And Russia wants to go into the North Atlantic to interrupt reinforcements from North America. So that's really the focus of the tension.
Now, when there are places where they've got submarines. I know the Kola Peninsula is where the Russians keep theirs, right? And Murmansk. And all. Now,
that's the point I was making, Meta, is that there's submarine bases on the Kola Peninsula, and they patrol in the Barents Sea area, and want to be kept free from attack submarines of NATO countries.
Well, if you think of the map of Russia, you think you realize they don't have much ocean frontage except right here in the Arctic. I mean, they have something on the Black Sea, and then they can have submarines way over here in Asia, yeah, which may have some use. But that explains why this area is so important to them, just because it is the only thing they've got, and it's kind of necessary when trying to think of controlling nuclear weapon equipped submarines, that what is Russia going to do if it has no access to the sea, whereas the US and others, they can get at the sea from all sorts of angles, and that's one of the considerations that you just can't avoid.
What about their submarines? Can they, or any submarines, go from east to west year round, or is it just in the summer?
No, they can go under the ice.
So anytime they're there all the time. Is that it? Some of them are around there all the time.
Yeah, the Barents Sea is not frozen over most of the year, but
well, it's not frozen over any part of the year, really. There's other maps which I have that just show you that this area is always free, whereas Canada in the winter is all frozen up, really frozen. And by the way, this is 1981 to 2010. That is the average extent of ice in over those years. See what happens now, and the shading has to do with how thick it is. So even though when the ice is there, it's much thinner, and it changes everything, really. And you can
But-
see the Northwest Passage, which is sort of in here.
But,
Different.
I mean, a
maybe
key point. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, just on the point of ice, when we have this nice map here, you can see that, I mean, this is taken in August, which is when the ice is usually least in the north of the Canadian archipelago. But what happens is that on the Russian side, the ice melts, but because of the currents and the winds, it drifts across and it piles up against the top, which for us is the top of Canada's Arctic archipelago. And so that's where you get the densest ice in the whole Arctic. And that is why our Northwest Passage is far harder to get through than it is on the Russian side, because it becomes relatively clear. Whereas on the Canadian side, that multi-year ice that's packed at the top of Canada's archipelago, it has the constitution of concrete. So even some of the most powerful icebreakers sometimes aren't able to get through there when they've been doing research missions.
Notice November 2021 is this map. Just very recent.
Well, now you say it's that much colder. I don't know why, but is it also true on land? Is the Canadian land mass with the permafrost and so on, is it harder and more permanent than in Russia?
In northern Norway, I mean, that's well 300 something like 300 kilometers above the Arctic Circle, and they do small scale farming and ranching up there. So it's a very different. It's a Gulf Stream affected climate there in a way that the Canadian North is not affected.
I mean, look at Russia has a huge population up in here, whereas Canada has I don't know 100,000 people or something.
Yeah.
By the way, about the submarine question, I understand there are planned patrols. Ernie probably knows more about this, but they don't just randomly go out under the ice. They used to have in the Cold War a huge number of patrols under the ice. Now the U.S. and Russia both have patrols, but and of course they try to hide from each other under the ice, and you can't hide as successfully when there's no ice to hide under.
There are not serious deployments under the ice. The Americans send attack submarines up there from time to time just to demonstrate that it can be done. And the Russians too, they go under the ice and then they surface somewhere near the North Pole as a kind of demonstration. But the kind of day-to-day patrols of the Russian submarines are in the open waters of the Barents Sea. The military tensions, as I was saying, are owed to strategic considerations and conflicts elsewhere. They don't owe to intrinsic conflicts in the Arctic itself, and over land claims and over those kinds of things. In fact, there's generally a community of interest, of shared interest there, in the sense of the interest in a stable region, interested in safe shipping, and those kind of things. So the tensions come that are imported from Europe and North America.
For years, the Arctic is a zone of peace, whatever. That's Gorbachev long ago. That it's not militarized, and everyone insists the Arctic is not militarized. And I'd be interested in Ernie's comments on whether now we have to say, well, it's either is already militarized, it's certainly becoming militarized.
Well, it's certainly militarized in the sense that there are substantial military installation. I mean, in the work that we've done, we've identified 74 military installations in the Arctic. I mean, that's beyond a sort of a single radar or something, but military bases and those kinds of facilities. About half of them are Russian, and about half of them are the other eight countries. So there's a major military presence, but as I was saying, It has to do with the same kind of military presence that we have along the Atlantic coast in Canada and the Pacific coast in Canada, and the Americans do then to patrol the frontiers, to know when people are entering into our waters and when they're not. That's the function of most of that activity in the military bases strung across the north of Russia.
So it's almost fair to say it's like a Coast Guard that looks after rescue operations.
Well, aid to the civil authorities is really the primary function, and so that's emergency response, search and rescue, escorting, shipping, those kind of things.
A recent issue of Peace Magazine, Elizabeth had a wonderful article sort of complaining about hearing too much about accusations that there are military tensions. Elizabeth, why don't you recapitulate your beef on that issue?
Okay, and I might just pick up on what Ernie was saying too and say that the Arctic countries have a vested interest in cooperation, and they cooperate in many venues, but particularly through the Arctic Council. And they certainly have a vested interest in making sure that they together remain at the forefront of making decisions for the Arctic. And, maybe making sure that China's not too involved. So they have a range of shared interests, and maybe you started with the global warming, and maybe we could get back to that because that's obviously another shared interest. But yes, what concerns me is the number of times when Russia takes any action vis-a-vis Arctic resources, it's always seen as a harbinger of war-like activities to come. And in March 2021, Russia decided to file 2 addenda to its submission pertaining to its continental shelf and the Arctic Ocean. And it decided that it was going to claim the area all the way from its exclusive economic zone, in other words, from 200 nautical miles offshore, all the way over to the exclusive economic zones of Canada and Greenland. And so the cry went up that Russia's trying to take the whole Arctic, and you have to put these things in historical perspective. And what started this whole train of claiming more and more actually was our own then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who decided in 2013 that instead of abiding by an agreement Canada had with Denmark, that Denmark was going to claim, or Denmark, Greenland, were going to claim everything to the east of the Lomonosov Ridge, and Canada would claim everything to the west of the Lomonosov Ridge.
Where's that? That ridge?
We don't have I don't think I can point it out on this map. My mouse isn't showing up on your map, is it?
Right, and Adele's mouse wasn't either when I asked her to point it.
Well, basically, if you think about going north from Ellesmere Island and Greenland all the way over to Russia, that's roughly where the Lomonosov Ridge runs. It runs to the west of the North Pole, so significantly to the west of the North Pole. So when Stephen Harper came out and said he was going to claim the North Pole for Canada, this was obviously in violation of the agreement Canada had with Denmark, Greenland, that Canada was not going to claim that far over. So when Denmark went and made its submission the following year, it made a much more extensive claim than it had originally planned to, and it went all the way from the exclusive economic zones of Canada and Greenland all the way over to Russia. Now, Canada did claim around the North Pole, which alienated the Danes, but it drew an arbitrary line that's sort of 2/3 of the way from Ellesmere Island towards Russia.
I want to see where Ellesmere Island is, and then
it's covered up by this Lomonosov Ridge.
It's just to the west of Greenland, at the top of Greenland to the west.
Can you see my pointer?
To the left or right? When you talk about
the left,
I can't even think in those terms.
When you're looking, it's to the west.
To the left, yeah.
I'm going to the left to see the west, right?
Right.
Because I can't, I'm sorry, but my poor brain doesn't work when I get that up there. Okay, so left is west and right is east, and this little patchy or big bunch of cluster of what looks like islands or something, is that Ellesmere?
Well, one of them is Ellesmere, and it's
Okay.
probably this one. It's right near to Greenland.
Yeah,
And actually, it's supplied from Greenland. That's how it gets any supplies. Anyway, there's a Canadian, that's the major Canadian presence right there and very far north. But there's very little Canadian military presence anywhere in this part. Anyway, this purple stuff is Canada's claim that Elizabeth was just talking about.
This purple, I don't see it on this.
No,
I don't think we can see it on this. But the bottom line is really that when Russia decided that it was going to extend its continental shelf all the way over to the exclusive economic zones of Canada and Greenland, it was basically saying that there's no room for Canada and Greenland to have an extended continental shelf. However, in doing that, Russia was doing exactly what Denmark had already done a few years earlier. And now that Russia and Denmark have both done this, I expect soon Canada is going to decide that it will expand its claim and go all the way over to Russia's exclusive economic zone. So in other words, Russia is just behaving the way other countries are behaving. And yet when Russia does it, it's seen as something very threatening. Yet when Denmark did it, it received almost no international attention at all, or at least no attention in our media. So that's the kind of concern I have, that it's fear mongering. And of course, the more you fear monger, the more you engender a militaristic kind of response to that fear mongering.
Yeah, but if they both are, if everybody's claiming the same piece of ocean, sorry, but that does sound like a problem.
Well, it is a problem, but it's a problem that'll be solved peacefully. If you think of the Barents Sea, excuse me, that there was a big maritime boundary dispute between the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia and Norway that dragged on for about 40 years. And yet, even in the height of the Cold War, you never had the Soviet Union using military might to take what it wanted from Norway. They negotiated and they negotiated, and finally, at the end of 40 years, they reached a peaceful settlement, a legal settlement. And that's how these things work. And that's what will happen with the delimitation. Delimitation means the establishment of political boundaries. And so what you're going to have is all the Arctic coastal states that want to extend their continental shelves into the Arctic Ocean are all going to have to sit down and negotiate. And that process had started when Canada had the agreement as to how Canada and Denmark, Greenland were going to divvy up the area north of their exclusive economic zones. And then when Stephen Harper went and violated that, that whole piece of the puzzle sort of went down the drain. So they're going to be back to starting at square one. But the good news is that the legal advisors from all these countries are already meeting. They're already talking about this kind of thing. And so, they'll ultimately reach an agreement, and I have no doubt it'll be through Pacific settlement.
Well, I guess this seems like the entire ocean is claimed as though the continental shelves extend forever, even till the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And I don't believe that's probably physically true. There is some central Arctic Ocean, but enough like this doesn't show it. And that's you can only get to the central Arctic Ocean by going through all these other people's exclusive economic zones. So there's some talk about, demilitarized central Arctic Ocean, so forth. But, what is this? where is the Central Arctic Ocean? We just
Okay.
don't seem to know that it even exists anymore.
Well, there's two issues here. One is beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones, it's freedom of the high seas. The coastal state has no rights over the water column. It's only talking about certain resources of the seabed and subfloor. So you're talking about non-living natural resources of the seafloor. So that would be oil, gas, minerals. And then you're also talking about some sedentary species, living species, and that would be things like barnacles and corals. So it's when you're looking beyond 200 nautical miles, it's only about seabed resources and certain kinds of seabed resources at that. The other issue, though, when you're talking about how much of the Arctic Ocean's continental shelf will be left to develop by the international community, the answer is very little. There'll be one sort of hole that's near the Geckel Ridge, and there's going to be another one in the Beaufort Sea. Not the Beaufort Sea, the Canada Basin. So, and that has implications for the common heritage of humanity, that the Law of the Sea Convention represents tremendous pulling and hauling and compromises. And the one of the compromises was, if you're going to allow coastal states to have continental shelf extensions beyond 200 nautical miles from shore, then you have to have these countries paying a price for it, because otherwise that continental shelf will be considered the international seabed, and it would be it's mandated to be developed for the common heritage of humanity. But it's not too surprising when you look at this map and you see that there are countries all the way around. It's like the Mediterranean. There's countries basically on every side. So it's not surprising that the maritime zones extend out from all those countries. And as you go out, the coastal state has fewer and fewer rights. So in the exclusive economic zone, they have rights to living and non-living resources. Whereas you go beyond that, then you're just talking about seabed resources and only certain kinds of seabed resources.
Elizabeth, what happens if another country, not the country that has that zone, wants to transit that zone or get resources from it? What are the rules?
Okay, well, there's the two completely separate regimes. There's so we'll deal in terms of the actual seabed resources of the continental shelf. If it's once Canada has delineated it, and then it needs to have its delineation reviewed by the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and the Commission makes recommendations to the coastal state, and it's the coastal state that actually establishes its extended continental shelf. But it has to be on the basis of those recommendations if it wants to have international legitimacy for them. But there is no legal obligation to do what the Commission says, but practically it makes sense. So so Canada on its extended continental shelf has sovereignty to those resources I already referred to, and Canada can then decide that it's going to let a Chinese company come in and develop it. As long as Canada retains control, there's no problem under international law. When you're talking about transit, that's a completely different issue. And the big issue for Canada is the status of the Northwest Passage. Canada argues that it's an internal waterway, and internal waterways mean that, well, step back for a moment. In order to establish maritime zones, a coastal state that has a very indented coast draws lines between the headlands, and these are called straight baselines. So instead of having boundaries that weave in and out with every little dipsy doodle in the coastline, you draw lines across the headlands, and then you start measuring out. All the water that's on the land side of a straight baseline line is considered internal water, and the state has complete sovereignty over its internal waters. It can decide who can come in and who can't come in. Now, the United States does not accept our drawing of straight baselines around our Arctic archipelago, and it says that the Northwest Passage, with its 5 different routes you can actually take, is actually a strait used for international navigation. And there is the right of unimpeded transit through a strait used for international navigation. Even if there's places in the Northwest Passage where the area between the islands is small enough that it would be still considered territorial sea. But if it's a historic claim that this strait has been used for international navigation, then Canada can't do anything to stop transit as long as it, is continuous transit through. But it's an unimpeded. It has an unimpeded transit is permitted. So it depends. They're 2 separate regimes, and they are often confused in the media. But one's about resources, and in this case, resources of the deep seabed of the seabed, and the other one is about the right to transit through the Northwest Passage. Now, Russia treats its passage as being completely under its own control, and the United States doesn't like the fact that Russia has implemented various regulations that do indeed impede the right of transit. So on this issue, actually, we have most in common with Russia.
Well, there's some Russian territory that may be relevant to, Russia insists on whatever. But Canada has a lot of problems. I mean, maybe Canada has no problems. I'm sure Ernie knows more about this, maybe. But the US and Canada have agreed, have they not, to disagree on the Northwest Passage. But if you look at the map and you're a Canadian, you just can see what is going on here. This is Canadian. That's how we see it. But for political reasons, the US prefers not to see it that way.
Yes, they don't want to establish precedents. And they've always argued that if they agree that the Northwest Passage is an internal waterway, then this sets precedents for other parts of the world, like the Strait of Hormuz and things like that. But, there are other people, though, like former US Ambassador to Canada, Paul Cellucci, and some former admirals in the US Navy who've actually testified before the US Senate and said that the United States should recognize the Northwest Passage as being Canada's internal waterways, because obviously Canada, its ally, is not going to tell the United States it can't use the passage, but it would enable Canada to deal with transits that we don't want. Well, neither country wants to be going through that there, and that would be, it could be terrorism, it could be illegal immigration, it could be drugs, it could be, any number of things. So actually, I would argue, and these other people have already argued, that it's in the United States' best interest to recognize that, but that's not how the United States sees it.
Meta, I was just going to comment on Elizabeth's comment about the way in which every move that Russia makes is reinterpreted or is interpreted as being hostile, threatening, and all of that sort of thing. And a striking example of that is, or evidence of that, is that the rhetoric and interpretation of that is really post 2014. I mean, before 2014, certainly in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, there was a much greater sense of cooperation. Russia was already doing some rebuilding its bases during that time related to the Northern Sea Route and other sovereignty interests. But there we interpreted those moves much more benignly than we did following 2014 and the annexing of Crimea.
Okay. Well, the current situation in Europe sounds, the situation on the border of Ukraine is certainly increasing tensions too. Let's hope that it doesn't increase the paranoia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think one other point about the relative security and solidity of the Arctic is that all of the 8 Arctic states are stable, well-governed states, and they're not susceptible to disruption and to interference, political interference in their affairs. I mean, it's a pretty solid group, and it's really, which is not Ukraine. Ukraine is the opposite. It's very susceptible to that kind of interference, and I think we forget that a great deal of national security owes to the competence and stability of national governance in a state. Now, I mean, it's well-governed, stable states are much less susceptible to interference than are internally unstable states and divided states. So that's another. I mean, the Arctic is quite a strong region in that sense. The Ilulissat Declaration should always be recalled. And agreed to in 2008, renewed in 2018, in which all of the Arctic Ocean states got together and basically agreed that the current international law is the guide through which disputes will be settled and settled peacefully. And that's not only been rhetorical; that's really has been the way that states have acted.
What about some of the other dangers in the Arctic oceans? I'm thinking of, for example, the fact that there are a number of sunken ships with toxic waste, radioactive waste that could be leaking and that sort of thing that could be really dangerous. And I don't know what, I expect that most of them are Russian, if not all of them, but I'm not sure. But also, I'm very worried about the clathrates, melting and emitting methane. I've seen videos of one of the Russian ships going through, I guess it was the Laptev Sea, or someplace along the Siberian coast, where there were plumes of white cloud. It was like being in a plane looking out the window as you go through clouds. Everywhere there was white, and you could see popping up ahead of you little plumes of these white clouds, enormous amounts of methane being released, and a fear, a very realistic fear, I'm afraid, that there's an enormous reservoir of methane which could burst, which could be very explosive, and it would frankly be probably game over, because right there you'd have at least a 2-degree increase in global temperature centigrade, like, I don't know, overnight, or at least within a couple of years, and there's no solution to it. So I'm more worried by far about the climate change in the Arctic than I am about the military confrontations that are possible. What do the military people say when they're talking about these threats? Do they have any real conversation about what to do? I mean, it's really hard to think of anything to do. There are the potential for things like cloud brightening experiments, but this is all, untested. And I just wonder. I don't want to see security relegated to questions about international missiles when the real threat is things bubbling up out of the bottom of the ocean.
Well, this is not widely known, is it? Because there's no answer to it, and climate change makes it even more necessary for the Arctic nations to act as though the Arctic is part of the global area. And what happens is Russia, for instance, with respect to climate change, is definitely determined to access its natural gas resources there, which therefore is more fossil fuels, which will eventually, end up in the atmosphere. And there seems to be no way of really stopping that, because Russia needs the money, and that's where its fossil fuel resources are. So there are a lot of issues where you connect security and climate change, not just the methane, which is being ignored. I mean, some of it is being absorbed in the ocean again, even when it's released, but if it's shallow, it comes up. So our future is not exactly certain with respect to all of those issues. And of course, building in the Arctic, where permafrost, destroys things right, left, and center. The cost of repairing all of those permafrost collapses where there's structures is kind of mind-boggling.
Well, this last week there was a motion to declare the linkage between climate change and security, and I think it was in the Security Council that Russia vetoed it. Actually vetoed it, and they simply want to say, well, we declare that there's no connection. Well, I'm sorry, but there is, and the Pentagon knows there is. If you talk to people who go to the Pentagon, they're very worried and very, I don't know what they are allowed to say independently, but certainly they're cognizant of the problem. And the Russians are, pretending it's not true. It's even true of people in Russia who are ordinary citizens, who are progressive people, that there's a tendency to, public discourse is much milder when they talk about global warming issues. They certainly don't sound any alarms as a rule. And so if the public is simply not sufficiently aware of how bad things really are, and I don't know what to do about it.
Well, the public is blissfully unaware of most of this. I mean, they've heard that the ice is melting. Well, so what? They've even now heard that affects the climate. But all these other issues are totally out of the general public, I think, for the moment, and I'm not sure when they'll ever come in. But one of the things that really is of concern that we haven't mentioned yet is that China thinks the Arctic is a place for them to come and exploit resources and do it at their own. They have a number of different very powerful icebreakers that they can use, which they've illustrated by crossing the Arctic many times, even across the North Pole. But we have one situation in the last year where Canada did, to my mind, the right thing, which is that China wanted to take over a mine on something called Hope Bay, which faces on eventually the Northwest Passage. And if they had done that, that meant that Chinese vessels had total access to come into the Arctic on the excuse that they had to come for commercial purposes. And yet maybe those weren't all commercial. So anyway, the government of Canada decided that they could not be allowed to purchase that mine. But this kind of thing will continue on because China really thinks of the Arctic, and other countries do too. India, even Belgium recently, it's strange that those countries are taking a big interest in the Arctic and they want to be Arctic Council observers. And it's all because let's go and exploit the resources of the Arctic. And so there is conflict coming if it hasn't come already. And it doesn't seem that our country is particularly prepared for that. We don't even have a big military base in the Arctic.
I don't see China, though, apropos its resource activities. I mean, yes, the argument can be made that the more transits they do, the more scientific study, the more they know what the contours of the seabed are, etc., the easier it will be if they ever want to do anything militarily. But I don't see, certainly not in my lifetime, or maybe even my son's lifetime, China trying to do it militarily. And why would it? It's so effective with its investments. I mean, we look at Africa and the incredible, and that's what it tries to do. So I think there are very real concerns, but I don't think it's about China going to muster a military. I think it's much more that China, through insidious ways, is going to get to the point where it can exercise more and more control that may or may not be in our best interest from any point of view. And that is a real concern. You know, since we're all getting close to being out of time, I just wanted to mention one thing that may be encouraging, not profoundly encouraging given the kind of problems we've talked about, but the Reykjavik Declaration of May 2021, which was agreed to by all 8 of the Arctic countries in the Arctic Council. It recognized the fact that the environment that there's global warming in the Arctic that's warming at 3 times the rate that you see in the rest of the world. So that is a recognition that's coming out. And the other thing that I thought was encouraging is that certainly the environment and climate change got priority in terms of that declaration. Now that, of course, is a long way from saying they've got great concrete action coming out of it. But it was nice to see that recognition. And I think it's very discouraging that we get so little media coverage of that kind of thing. You get lots of it when Russia decides that it's going to revise its submission, which it's entirely entitled to do. But when there are important facts, like 3 times the rate, that's something everybody should know and be concerned about. And the fact that there is priority in a declaration given to it should be something that is publicized much more, that because there you have all 8 of the Arctic countries saying, hey, this is a very serious problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And it just, I mean, I'm getting back to the military element, but I think one of the things that is striking is in the last year, and certainly in the last few months, you see a lot more reference to people, Russians and others, looking for avenues of cooperation in the Arctic, and just things like the resumption of talks between the chiefs of defense staff in the Arctic and Arctic defense forums, and from think tanks advocating ways in which cooperation can be more real. I mean, I think you see there's still a lot of fear mongering clearly, but I think that there are also some counter voices.
During the Cold War, I was always going to Russia, and all kinds of people were going back and forth. We had 10 times as much contact among civilian activists and researchers as I would think there is now. Do you see any initiatives that will renew any of those contacts? Because I think those things are really important. Do you folks have such contacts with people in Russia? And if you don't, what are you going to do about it?
I don't. The North American North American Arctic Defense Security Network, something roughly that, really run by Whitney Lockenbauer and colleagues, I think is a pretty positive development. It's a network of academics, essentially, academics and practitioners. And there's a lot of reaching out, some to Russia, but especially also to indigenous peoples in the Arctic, and engaging them in responding to security issues. And I just can't resist mentioning an article I've just been looking at, 1989, written by our current Governor General, Mary Simon, and it's a wonderful, extensive article on interest and indigenous interest in Arctic as a zone of peace, picking up the Gorbachev theme. So some of those themes are still there and are getting a little bit more attention and broadcast, I think.
What isn't encouraging is that Canada in 2019 made a big effort to go to get a new Arctic and Northern policy, and stated all sorts of marvelous things that they would do, but they are not putting the effort in to actually follow up and put the resources in and spend the money and the effort. And we in this country are going to end up being vulnerable when all around us development is occurring and Canada is still far behind.
Elizabeth, we're getting toward the end. Why don't we say that you have the final word?
Okay, well, I agree with Adele in terms of the fact we're not seeing the level of action at the political level, I'd say, at any of the countries that we would hope for. Just in terms, when you're talking about networks, the scientists have been cooperating for years, and there's a tremendous amount of cooperation that takes place with all different kinds of scientists from all the Arctic countries. And they don't seem to be nearly as concerned with borders as so many others are. The other thing is we have an increasing network of legal documents. The Arctic Council has done tremendous amount of work in terms of studying the environment, publicizing these findings, and that is a facility, obviously, for a lot of cooperation, and it includes voices like the 6 permanent participants, which are Indigenous organizations. And my point that there is an increasing number of legally binding agreements for search and rescue, for oil spills, for marine scientific research. There's one on fishing that hasn't, as far as I know, come into force yet, but certainly I hope it's heading that way. So the more you get, it's kind of David Matrani's idea that the more you get networks of cooperation, I think the more it leads to greater levels of cooperation.
Thank you all. It's been fascinating. And I'm going to take heart from your reassurances that all these ominous sounds are half phony, and don't worry about it. Okay. Happy Christmas, everybody. We're getting toward that time of year.
Merry Christmas.
Same to you all, everyone. Yes.
Yes.
Bye. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. And this is episode 385. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. We even post the transcripts eventually there. When you get to the website, do look around, because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.